and welcome to this presentation. I really appreciate DynamicsCon allowing me to present to you today. My name is Dave Weiser, and I am a Senior Solutions Consultant Team Lead with Tagunya and a veteran presenter here at DynamicsCon, and I really appreciate that opportunity to be here. What we're going to talk about today is mistakes. Oops, I made a mistake. What did I do? Every time that we use Business Central, unfortunately, there are times when we're going to make mistakes. There are going to be times when the system posts something we didn't expect, and we're going to need to go back and correct that. So this session today is we're going to talk about some of those common errors, some of the common issues that we have with the system, and figure out how we can go about solving those within this presentation. So if we get to my agenda for today, these are the things that we're going to look at as we move throughout the presentation. We're going to look at general ledger issues. What happens if I post to the wrong GL account, make the wrong GL entry? If I need to reverse entries, how do I do that? A new feature within Business Central is the ability to correct dimensions. And so we're going to look at how we can do that and see those corrections. Also, there's a number of accounts receivable and account payable issues that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about using the wrong vendor or the wrong customer and how we can fix those, how we can fix posting invoices, application errors, using wrong posting codes, and how we can correct from those kinds of things. We're also going to talk about 1099 errors and how we can fix those codes, return to vendor issues, voiding checks, wrong area codes, just a lot of the things that sometimes around AR and AP that we see. Also, we're going to talk about some manufacturing issues, and these can get a little bit dicey when you have missing consumption on production orders or output and how you can correct that. There's not a lot of things that you can do, but there are some things that we can do to fix those. And also, if you have incorrect item costs, we're going to talk about how you can address those as well. A couple of caveats and reminders that I wanted to bring up at the very beginning here is one, Business Central doesn't delete entries, and it doesn't allow you to change entries, ledger entries, except in a couple of instances that we're going to talk about. There are some other systems out there that will allow you to delete entries, ledger entries, or change them. But Business Central doesn't generally allow this, and financial auditors really don't want you to do it anyway. They like to have that audit trail on how changes were made throughout the system and not allow you to just change transactions. That really is a no-no from a financial audit standpoint. So they really don't like you to take a look at or to make those changes. So we're going to jump right in and take a look at some of the changes, wrong journal entries, and how you can make those transactions or those corrections. So we're going to move over to Business Central and take a look at how we can make some of those transactions. So in this case, we're going to take a look at one where we've posted something to the wrong account. So if I go to my chart of accounts and I take a look at, let's just take a look at one account, for example, maybe this rent expense. As we drill into it, we can see all the transactions that are in there. If you've posted something to the wrong account, really there's really no way of changing it other than doing a reclass. You can reverse the transaction that you made from this screen, but actually moving it to the right account or fixing those transactions is really something you're going to have to do manually. You can reverse from here. So if we take a look at one of these transactions, maybe this January transaction we don't like, we can go ahead and reverse it. Now you can post manually a correction if you want, or if you just want to reverse the transaction in whole, you can highlight the transaction and come up to process and click on reverse transaction. When that happens, the system is going to present to you the transaction that it is going to reverse. So if we expand the whole thing, we'll see it's going to reverse that entire transaction. If one of the lines in here was correct and you just needed to reclassify one of them or just a select couple, that's where I mentioned you might be able to do that with just a simple journal entry. But if you need to reverse the whole transaction, you can do that from within here. Just go ahead and click on reverse. After you see that, it'll have you confirm that. It'll tell you it'll make correcting entries, which it then does. And you can see in here that it's actually posted a second transaction to reverse out that original transaction. So that's one way of doing that. The other way is if you have a whole bunch of entries you need to make, maybe it was a whole posting area, you can reverse a register as well. So if we go into the GL registers, these will show all of the transactions that occurred, and anything basically as you're dealing with some of these transactions you can go ahead and reverse, but you can only reverse them really if they were GL transactions. If it was from a sales posting or a purchase posting, you're not going to be able to reverse those transactions from here because there's a lot more tables involved. This is really just the GL. In fact, if you tried to do that from a sales, come up to reverse, you'll see that it's even grayed out, that you can't do it, or you'll get a message basically telling you that you can't do it. So if we come down here, for example, to this general journal up here, we can click on reverse, and it is even reversed because it was probably a reversal itself. So just be aware of that. You won't be able to reverse those kind of transactions. But the same process here, you click reverse, it'll show you what you're going to do, and then you just confirm it. Now, if you click the wrong dimension, that's where you've got another issue that you can go ahead and fix. And this is actually a new feature that Business Central added just a couple of versions ago. So I'm going to come up into one of my sales accounts here. I'm going to go 40200 and drill into the transactions. And you can see I've got a number of transactions here. I'll just focus on this first invoice for $1,900. And you can see I've got the sales department and the customer group department. That I'm going to say was the wrong dimension, and I need to go ahead and fix it. So in order to go ahead and fix it, I can click on entries, and there is a new option there called correct dimensions. So when I click on that for that entry, it'll come up and it'll show me all of the dimensions that are available for that transaction and then what you can do with them. So this was large. I actually want to make that something else. I want to make it medium because that's really what the dimension should have been. Once you make whatever changes you need to, you can click on run up here at the total. I'm going to run this immediately. You can schedule it to run after hours if you want, but I'm going to go ahead and have it run immediately. So that was successful. So now if I refresh this screen, you'll see that the customer group is now medium for this transaction. The other thing that's nice about this is you can actually see the history of the changes that were made. So if I click on that item again and go to entry, I can see this history of dimension corrections. Click on that and it'll show me a whole list of the different entries that were made. So if I correct it multiple times, you'll see multiple lists in here. I can go ahead and click on this and it'll show me that for this transaction, it was large. We changed it to medium. And so you can see all of the changes necessary, especially if your auditors are wondering what's going on. Now, I will warn you about this transaction or about this functionality. As you can see, this was an invoice for this $1,900. When I change the dimension here, I only change the dimensions on the GL entry screen. The original document or the original invoice, if I need to, find those entries and go back, if I go back to that original invoice, so I'll wait for that to kind of open up, see this posted invoice. I'll go ahead and open up that posted invoice and come down to these lines. If I look at the dimensions associated with these lines, you'll still see that the large is the customer group. So the originating document still has the original dimensions. It's only on the GL entry table that you made those changes. So just be aware of that. It's a nice feature being able to change the dimensions on the GLs, but I don't think Microsoft has taken it as far as they need to right now by being able to go back to the source documents and also make those changes. So we'll go ahead and close that. Just wanted to kind of warn you about that respect. Now, the wrong vendor. If we move into some of the AR and AP changes, we've made the wrong vendor or you've posted to the wrong vendor. We need to be able to make that correction. So we're going to go about seeing how we can do that. First off, be sure that transactions are still open and that you can make those transactions. So in this case, we're going to create a purchase order. We'll go ahead and create that purchase order. We'll click new here. We're going to select 10,000 and we'll go ahead and put in the invoice number in here and we'll select our item. that we're going to purchase, the quantity, and the cost that we're going to want to put in there. Now, if you've already invoiced the purchase order, there's not much you can do about it. And we'll talk about how to change those and how to correct those in a little bit in a minute. But if we just want to change the vendor, we can do that from within this purchase order. So as long as the purchase order is here, we can change that, but only if it hasn't been received. So one of the things that we can do here is that we can go ahead and post the receipt, which I'll do. In that case, what you'll want to be aware is that if I try to change this vendor at this point, it'll kind of go through the steps, but it'll give me the error. Oh, because I got to reopen that. So let's reopen the purchase order. Try and change that to another vendor. It'll start to step through. Do you want to change the buy from? Yes, but then it hits an error very quickly because my line has been received already. So everything has to be totally clear in order for you to be able to make that change understandably. So if we click refresh, one of the things that you can do is if it's only been received, or in the case of a sales order, if it's only been shipped, you can go ahead and reverse that. So if we go ahead and go to the receipts on this one, you'll see we can open up that purchase receipt. I can come down here to this function and I can undo the receipt. Now this you got to be careful of sometimes, because when you undo the receipt, since you've received that and it possibly went into a location in a bin, you also have to make sure that that quantity is still in that location and bin for you to be able to reverse that receipt transaction. If you've already consumed it or moved it someplace else, then you're not going to be able to reverse the receipt transaction. But in this case, we did. So in this case, our purchase order is back in its original state. Everything is still possible. So I can go ahead and change the vendor number to the correct vendor so I can get that sent to that PO sent to the correct vendor. One thing to look out for, and I've seen this in a couple of areas where people have kind of made this mistake. One is with these questions. First, you want to change the buy from vendor. So that's this vendor up here, and you want to say yes. You've modified tax area. Yes, we want to update the lines. Now, do you want to change the vendor? This is a second question, and it seems like a repeat of the first question, but what it's really asking is, do you want to change, in this case, the pay to vendor? And this is one where you've got to be very careful that you answer yes here. I've had some that answered no to this. And so what happens is the buy from vendor up here at the top is one vendor, but when they actually create the purchase invoice off of this purchase order, it's actually being paid to a second vendor. And then you end up paying the wrong vendor and things get messed up a little bit. So you want to make sure that if you're changing the vendors, that you'll always answer yes to the second question about changing the vendor, because then it will also change the pay to vendor, which is a little bit lower on the PO. We've also changed dimensions, so it's going to update that. So just basically, if you're changing the vendor, make sure you do everything, because down here in the shipping and payment area, that area is also going to need to be expanded so that you're paying the correct vendor and not a different one. If I hadn't have selected to change the pay to vendor, this would have filled out with another address. So just something to be aware of. As far as the wrong customers, the same process is kind of the same for sales orders as it is purchase orders. So be aware of that. Now, there's some features in the most recent versions of Business Central that allow you to basically automate the corrections of purchase orders and sales orders or posted invoices. So I'm going to go ahead and go to look at my posted sales invoices. So I can take a look at this first one up here, for example. We'll take a look at maybe the second one, and we can correct that. So if we go ahead and open it, we can say, well, maybe there's something wrong about this issue. And up here on the menu is an option to correct. And when I select that, I really have three options. And so there's a little bit of confusion as to what those different options really provide. So if we take a look at my PowerPoint slide here really quick, This really describes what's going to happen in the system if you select one of these transactions. So uh, the easiest one is create corrective credit memo. All that's going to do is create a credit memo. It's almost like manually creating a credit memo and using the copy document feature to copy the posted sales invoice. So it's going to create the credit memo and leave it open. That basically allows you then, if you need to make changes on that credit memo, you can make those changes on the credit memo. The second option is to cancel. When you cancel that, not only is it going to create the credit memo, but it's going to post it as well. So if the invoice just needs to be canceled in whole, everything just needs to be done, just go ahead and click cancel. It'll create a credit memo. It'll apply that credit memo to the invoice, and everything will just be shown as cleared. Now, as you'll recall, Business Central doesn't really get rid of transactions. So canceling doesn't mean you're canceling the invoice. It kind of does, but the posted sales invoice will still be there. There'll just now be a posted sales credit memo that'll apply to that open invoice and quote unquote cancel it for you. The third option is correct, because maybe sometimes you posted something incorrectly, it had the wrong price, you need to re-invoice with the right pricing on it. Correct is the option that you want to use, because what that will do, as you see, is it will post the credit, or it will create the credit memo, it'll post the credit memo, and then it will create the new invoice. It won't post the new invoice because presumably you need to make some changes, whether it's a pricing change or terms or something else like that. It'll go ahead and create the credit memo and post it to get rid of that original invoice, and then give you that option to create the new one. So just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that as you move forward. So let's go back over to Business Central and talk about, so that's those three functions. We can talk about some additional things. The next one we're going to take a look at is application errors. There may be times when either on the customer side or on the vendor side, payments are made and they're actually made to the wrong customer, or you're applying a payment to the wrong invoice from either a payment side or an AP side or an AR side. So let's go ahead and talk about how we can make some of those changes from the application side. So we'll go ahead and close these screens, and we're going to go ahead and look at our customer ledger. So we'll take a customer ledger entries. And so we're going to take a look at these. Let me close my fast tabs, or my fact boxes, off to the side. And we're going to filter on one of our customers, and we're just going to look at customer 40,000. Okay. So you can see in here we have an invoice down here where we've got a payment of invoice 103168, and it was applied to this invoice. So we got a payment that was applied to this one. We also have another open invoice that was for the same amount. Now, this is some of the demo Kronos data, so some of the document numbers aren't necessarily linked up right. But what we can say is, let's say that this invoice shouldn't have applied to this invoice, but it should have applied to this one up here. How do I go about making that change for those applications so that I can make sure that I'm showing the correct open documents, whether it's on the customer ledger or on the vendor ledger entry? So from here, what we want to do first is, since this payment is the wrong application, is we need to get rid of that application first. So if we go up to the entry and go, let me get the right place. We want to actually unapply. So in the process, we click on unapply. What that'll do is it'll then bring up another screen, similar when we were looking at that screen on the reversal of the journal entries. It showed you what it was going to do. The same thing here, when you click unapply, the system is going to tell you what it's going to do. So these are all the transactions it's going to make. If you like that, you can go ahead and click unapply. And they'll be correcting entries that will be posted. Yes, we want to do that. Click on yes. Click on apply, and you can see now that these entries are now open, whereas before they were all closed out. Now, because of that, what we can do is reapply the entry. So in this case, we're going to take a look at this payment again, and we're going to go to that entry, and we're going to go to process and apply the entries. So once we apply the entries, the system will show all the open invoices. This was the line this was originally applied to, but in this case, we want to apply it to this one. So we go ahead and hit select, click on process, and set the applies to. What that does then is then link that payment to that invoice. Now at this point, if we just closed it, nothing else would happen. We actually need to post the application. When we originally posted a payment, whether it was an AP or in this case an AR deposit payment, hopefully we applied it at that time. And so when we applied it during that payment or deposit process, there was a posting routine that not only posted the payment, but posted the application at the same time. Here, there is no underlying posting routine that is going to post this transaction. So we actually have to post this application manually. So once that application link is created, go back to process, you'll see there's another function to post the application. So once you do that, it'll just confirm what document number and document date, posting date you want to use, click OK, and it goes through and reposts that transaction to using the correct payment. So you can see now that this original invoice that was originally closed by this payment is now still open, and that this line up here, which was the one that was open, we've actually reapplied to. This reapplication process can be done, like I said, on both the AP and on the AR side, but it gives you that opportunity after you've posted the original payment to correct those applications in the event that you posted something incorrectly. And so it's a really big help for you to be able to do that. Now, there may be a time also where you've got a wrong posting code. The posting codes were set up maybe incorrectly, or maybe it wasn't an error. Maybe it's just a progress in your business where you actually need to change a posting code. How do you go about doing that? So we're going to take a look at our inventory posting setup. Oops, let me get it right so it thinks it finds the right spot. Inventory posting setup. You can see that all of our inventory accounts are this one account. Let's say that for this location, though, for this particular inventory posting code, you want to change that to a different GL account. Now, be aware this isn't really a correction. It may be if something's not posting to a correct account. But when you do this, be aware that all you've done is change the way the system is going to post for future transactions. It is not going to go back and fix prior transactions. And that's also true on any of the posting setup fields. So if it's the general posting setup, the customer posting groups, the vendor posting groups, the bank account posting groups, if you change the GL account that is being used, the system is not going to automatically reclassify any balances on the GL. That's going to have to be done manually. So when you've made that change, you'll then, in this case, it's an inventory posting group, you would need to run the inventory valuation to find out what's the value of the inventory in this location for this inventory posting group. Once you've got that valuation, then you can do a manual journal entry to move that balance from, in this case, account 10700 to 10750. So that'll have to be done manually. Same is true if you change a posting code, maybe an AR code on a customer ledger. If you change a sales amount in the general posting setup, any of those posting setup codes, if you change, you have to manually make the reclass. If you don't, then as you try and do reconciliations at the end of the month or periodically and trying to reconcile your subsystem, your subledger system back to the GL, you'll be out of balance. And you'll be out of balance, basically compensating balances between two different accounts. So just be aware of that as you're looking at that with the wrong posting codes. Now, we just finished the end of the year a couple months ago, and a lot of companies had to send out 1099 forms. And there is some good functionality within Business Central to be able to capture the 1099 information and report it properly. There may be times, though, that the 1099 code or the amount that was posted was the incorrect amount that was posted. All of that is controlled in the vendor ledger. So if we take a look at the vendor ledger file, vendor ledger entries, as I mentioned before, Business Central doesn't really allow you to change ledger entries. Once something is posted to the vendor ledger or the detailed ledger underneath it, value entries, it doesn't like to get rid of those entries or change anything on here. This is one of those areas where you can actually make changes to the vendor ledger entry, and that is the 1099 code and the 1099 amount. So if I scroll all the way over on my vendor ledger entry all the way to the right, because they're usually at the end, you'll see I've got the IRS 1099 code and the IRS 1099 amount. If I go ahead and click on Edit List, you'll see that it opens up the ability to edit this. And about the only thing you can edit here are these codes. So if you need to change a code or you need to change an amount that's in here, you can go ahead and click on the code, see the list of codes you need to, and change that to whatever it needs to be. Maybe it needs to be to the new NEC01, and then you've got the amount that you want to put in based on the amount that's over here. You can make those additions or those corrections directly to the vendor ledger entry. So like I said, that's one of the few areas where you can actually make changes within the vendor ledger entry is to those accounts directly within the vendor ledger. Now, if we want to take a look at voiding checks and reissuing, may not be an error. It may be just that the customer or the vendor didn't get the check and you need to void it. We're going to take a look at, if we go back to the vendor ledger again, look at our vendor ledgers, and we're actually going to filter. I've got a quick filter set up for this one vendor. So you can see I've got a payment that was made, and it actually applied to these 3 invoices and closed them all out. That remaining amount is 0. This also may be an instance we talked about earlier where the wrong vendor was selected, and you need to void this check and basically resend a check or something like that. That is done by voiding by clicking on the check ledger entry. That's where you want to go first. You go to the check ledger entry, it's going to give you a list of all the checks that are out there. So you'll find the one that you want to void, highlight it, and then as you click on process, you can void the check. Now, when you void the check, you're going to get this screen where there's a couple of options. One, it's going to give you the date, which is generally going to default to the check date. But then you can see unapply and void check or just void check. And there's some confusion as to what those two mean and how they react within the system. A lot of times what you'll want to do is unapply and void. So it'll void the check, plus it'll unapply those underlying vendor ledger entries so that you can post them again. If you just void the check, all it's going to do is void that check on the vendor ledger entry and create an open payable as far as the payment is concerned, but it's not going to unapply the underlying invoices. So it may be that you just need to reissue a check. So you just want to void it and then reissue it. Maybe they didn't get it or it got damaged somehow before they got it. You can go ahead and void it and do a void only, or and then just process that payment. Now, when you make that payment, you're actually paying a payment, and that's where it sometimes gets confusing, because when you go to the payment journal, you're actually paying a payment. You're not paying an invoice, because those invoices are all applied. You're actually paying a payment, so just be aware of that. In this case, we are going to unapply them at the same time. So if I click on yes, you'll see that the check now shows as financially voided. And if I close that, you'll see that those my payment now has been applied, or my void has been applied to my payment, and that those original invoices are now open and can now be fixed. I mean, maybe you need to correct the invoice like we talked about earlier through the correction phase, change vendors, do whatever you need to so that you can go ahead and make those correct payments as necessary. So that's a good way of being able to do that. A couple other areas that we're going to take a look at. One is, and this is more of a discussion, but as we take a look at the wrong tax area code. If you're using sales tax in the system and you've got the wrong area code, there's really not a lot of correction that you can do within the system other than using the correct functionality that we talked about earlier with sales invoices. And that may be one of the areas where you do need to use that correct functionality, where you create a sales credit memo, you go ahead and post the sales credit memo, and then recreate a new invoice and leave it open. At that point, you can then go to that invoice and change the tax area code, click off the tax liable if that's what was wrong. That's one of the changes that you can do. And that may be one of the reasons why you want to use that correct functionality. But just remember that if it's a tax area code, you really should use that functionality with a credit memo and then a re-invoice so that the tax table, the tax entry table, is populated correctly with all of the information, with the original invoice, the credit memo, and then the re-invoice. All that information is there because you can't make those changes directly to the tax entry table. So it's just a good way of being able to do it using that correct functionality. But that's one of those that have to be done manually. Unfortunately, I can't really show you a nice slick correction. And there are areas like that. The next two are also areas where we can't really make any cool corrections. If I come back over to my slides really quickly, one is with the manufacturing areas. The two issues: missing consumption, missing output from production orders. Be aware that if you have a production order that is finished, you can't make any changes to it. And that's just a safeguard. It would be nice that if there could be a way to be able to do that within Standard Business Central, but unfortunately, with those production orders, you can't reopen them and post corrections to them. And there may be times when you do have missing consumption, or you missed output, or you output the wrong quantity, that kind of thing. Now, granted, there are some safeguards. If you try and finish a production order where there's missing consumption completely, the whole line, the system will warn you. I mean, it's a soft warning, so you can click OK and go through it, but at least it gives you a warning that there's something on the components list for that production order where you haven't consumed anything. So when the system gives those errors, a lot of people just automatically kind of click OK through all of those error messages or those warnings. Just be aware that those warnings are there for a reason. And so if you have missing components, the system will warn you about it. If you have missing output, if the output is gone, you haven't posted any output, you're not going to be able to finish the production order at all. It'll just stop you from doing that. You have to have output at least one of your item in order to finish the production order. So there may be instances though where maybe the quantity was wrong, especially if you're outputting in batches or pallet quantities or that kind of thing, as opposed to just one big output of the quantity. There may be issues where you just need to be aware of that, and where you might have missed a pallet or missed a batch that needs to be output. The unfortunate part is you can't go back and fix those. So what can you do about it? As far as consumption is done, kind of really what you would do is do a negative consumption for the missing components. And then what I would also use is the original production order as the document number for that negative adjustment, because you want to get that consumption material, that raw material, out of inventory because it's no longer there. So do a negative adjustment to get it out of the inventory using the same document number. That way you can at least reference where it was or where it should have been. And then you can go ahead and revalue your output. Depending on your costing method will depend on where that revaluation needs to hit. If your output item was a standard cost item, then presumably if there was misconsumption, the finishing of that production order would have yielded a favorable material variance. So when you negatively adjust the consumption, that's going to hit your inventory adjustment column or account. You may want to reclassify that to that material variance to offset the favorable material variance with the write-off of that consumption. If the item is a non-standard cost item, then it is possible to do a revaluation of that item and revalue the output so that it flows properly through the system. So once you know the value of the consumption, you go ahead and do that revaluation. And we're actually going to look at revaluations in just a minute to be able to correct item costs. As far as missing output, if you output the wrong quantity, kind of the same effect, but in opposite, you're going to need to do a positive adjustment for the outputted item so that you have those quantities on hand with presumably the right cost. At that point, also, you'll need to be aware of one caveat now that you've got that product out there, is that you will have a small break as far as the traceability, because as you look at that product that you positively adjusted out there, if you try and trace it back to its origin, it's going to stop at that positive adjustment entry. It won't go back and look at any of the consumed raw materials. Also in there, adjust cost won't update the cost on those positively adjusted items if you had a change in the cost of your consumables. So for example, if your components, that cost changed because of a new invoice or an item charge or a costing adjustment there, normally adjust cost will push that change to the output items, but just be aware that with those positive adjustments, there's a break in that linkage, and so adjust cost won't adjust those positive numbers. So it gets a little dicey in there when you're looking at those manufacturing issues. So just be aware of that as you're looking at that. The last thing we want to look at is the wrong item cost and how we can make those changes. So we're going to go back to Business Central here. We're going to take a look at an item valuation. So first thing we want to do is go to our item ledger so we can take a look at a specific item. And so we're going to look at this account, or this item 1953-W. As you can see in here, we actually purchased some. We purchased 49 units. That's all been sold. The remaining quantity is 0. All these cost amounts have been put in place. Everything is there. And so if we ran the revaluation journal, we open the item revaluation journal, and if we went ahead and tried to calculate inventory, we'll need to make sure adjust cost is running, and that's fine. But if I wanted to do it just for that item, and that's all I did at this point, when I run that, well, first I have to have a document number. That's one of the things that I always forget. So we're just going to set test there. With this item and run that. Nothing comes up because the normal check inventory or calculate inventory is going to look at open inventory, because that's invariably what you want to revalue. Is I want to revalue the inventory that I have on hand. So it's going to calculate that open inventory at that particular time, present that to you so that you can revalue it. In this case, we don't have that. We can't revalue that open inventory. And in fact, what we want to do is go back to the original entry and revalue the original entry that was calculated. So in that case, we can go ahead, we'll go ahead and get rid of our document number. In order to do that, just go to any blank line, put in the number, the item number that's in question. Then off to the side, there's this column called applies to entry. What this applies to entry wants to be is the original entry, whether this was a positive adjustment, it could have been a purchase receipt, it could have been a production output. Like we talked about the missing consumption, and I need to revalue my output. This gives you that opportunity to select what that original output quantity was, or what that inbound entry was. In this case, I can go ahead and select that. When you select that, you'll see that the system will fill in automatically what was that original transaction. In this case, that original transaction was a positive adjustment of 49 units. And here was the cost of that, and here's the value of that. The next columns are what's the revalued amount. So that maybe should have been $100. That's what I want to revalue that inventory at. So as it does that, you'll see that it's going to post a positive adjustment of $490. If I go ahead and post that, I have my system set up. Oh yeah, I always have missed the document number. I have my system set up to run adjust cost automatically with every transaction. So after I post that, let's go ahead and close the journal. We're back here at our transactions, and we'll go ahead and refresh this page. You'll see that these cost amounts changed. Not only did this change here on the cost amount actual, but since adjust cost ran, it pushed that revaluation to any outbound entries that were associated with that transaction. Therefore, it gives you the ability to change the cost and flow that change in cost all the way through the system. Be aware, though, that at least in this case, since I've changed the cost amount on those transactions, it's also going to hit your cost of goods sold account. So depending on when these shipments occurred, as you can see, I had one in January and a couple in February. It's going to go back and post those adjustments back to the original posting date of those transactions. And as you can see here, it's marking these as adjustments. So it's going to go back and do that. So just be aware of that from that standpoint. So those were a lot of the corrections that we made to those areas. I'll be free to open up for any questions in just a minute on this live chat. But I appreciate you being here. I appreciate DynamicsCon for allowing me to present this information to you. If you have any questions, just reach out and get in touch with me. Thanks for attending.
Hi, welcome. I'm glad to be here. I hope you all enjoyed that session. Once again, my name is Dave Weiser, and just talking to you, at least answering any of your questions that you had. We had a couple of questions that came through the chat, and so go ahead and read those. A couple that I wanted to touch on directly, and I appreciate Donna's question about changing dimensions and the posting date. That, I guess, would be also an area where Microsoft should take a look at that, because that could impact your financial statements. You can go ahead and change dimensions on posted transactions, even if you're outside the allowed from and to posting dates. So that would be an area where obviously you're going to want to make sure you, through permissions, lock down the ability to change those dimensions. Jimmy also had a question about the run always. So that when you do change the dimensions and you click on run, there's that option to run only or run immediately, and can you have that defaulted? I don't see a way that you can. One of the things I would warn you about is if you do that, that may not be the best approach. So if somebody wants to run immediately, that may be something you want to really force them to do, because some of those changes, depending on how many dimensions you're changing, depending on the different ramifications, that process could take a little while, a few minutes. And so I'm not sure what the table locking will do in there to prevent other people from posting. So be aware of that. Check with your partner, see if that's something that can be modified on a user basis to have that flag always checked as yes, go ahead and run that. One of the things that I mentioned also, or I noted also in the when we were talking about IRS codes and changing the vendor ledger entry for the IRS 1099 codes and values, is those can also be changed through Rapid Start. So usually, like I said, you can't change ledger entries. Even in Rapid Start, you can't change them. But those two fields, because they are editable by the user, can be changed through Rapid Start. So as long as you bring out maybe all of the transactions and have the entry numbers, you can go ahead and put the new 1099 code in the amount. And then it's really like a 3-column Rapid Start package with entry number, IRS 1099 code, and IRS 1099 amount. Just go ahead and populate those and import that again through Rapid Start, and you can make those changes. Because obviously, if you're just implementing Business Central, or you're just starting to get into the 1099 process, and you hadn't had that code initially set, there's going to be a lot of transactions out there that are going to need to be set. And so you're going to have to spend a lot of time doing that. And it'll be easier to do it if you can export that, make all those changes at once, and bring that product back in. So that's there. There was a question, I think Deborah asked about assembly orders and reversing those. I will have to check into that. So if you want to chat, me or privately or something, your contact information, I'll check into that on whether you can reverse those easily through the normal process. It may be that you just have to do a normal output and reset up the components again, but I'll check into that for you and get back. I'm just not sure. So are there any other questions out there? I don't really see any others that are out there. So if you have any, I'll give you a quick 30 seconds to post them. Otherwise, we'll give you some time back on your session. So once again, I really appreciated you being here, and I really appreciate DynamicsCon and DUG for giving me the opportunity to present this information to you. Hopefully you found it useful, and hopefully we'll see you again in September at DynamicsCon Live in San Antonio. I plan on being there, and I'm looking forward to meeting all of you. So with no other questions, we'll turn that back over to you and go ahead and end the Q&A.